Ukraine on edge. President Volodymyr Zelensky sounding the alarm, warning that Putin's attack on Ukraine is not over, bracing for what will come next. It comes after Russia's massive and widespread strikes overnight. We have some dramatic new footage. You can see that there are more than 400 drones, 40 missiles fired across 9 Ri, and these are the scenes from Ka'ai where explosions lit up the sky. This is one of the largest attacks of the war, so far. The strikes, it seems a part of the response to Ukraine taking out so many of strategic bombers. They say 41 of Putin's bombers all carried out by drones, a weapon that Ukraine, of course, has used to completely redefine warfare itself. Katie Glaze is out front with a CNN investigation into exactly how they're doing a trillion IG-8 now. This attack, more than 18 months in the making, is a sigh. Ukraine has changed the face of modern warfare. This damaging air bases deep within Russian territory. A CNN analysis of thousands of D-strikes on Russia over the past 3 years, along with video and an exclusive interview. We can coordinate our drones in Moscow, etc., sheds light on how Ukraine's drone program has rapidly expanded since the start of the war. In the first months, you can see the attacks are mainly along the border area, but by the end of the year, they start hitting key military targets, like this blast shown on surveillance footage at a fuel depot at Engels Air Base in December 20. 5 months later, and the missions become more amp. This bold drone attack in May 20th even damaged the roof of the Kre, the heart of the Russian government and over 400 miles from Kiev. Drones are now frequently flying over Moscow, bringing the terror of war home to the Russian people. At the same time, Ukraine is my pressure on Russia's war supply wherever they are stored. In late summer of 2023, they target Pskov Air Base in northern Russia beyond Moscow, in satellite imagery taken short planes blade. You can see the damaged planes. By 2024, the number of drones getting sent into Russia is soar. In June alone, over 1,000 launch. According to CNN analysis, Ukraine's muscle comes from a coordinated national effort to make combat drones ready to be sent into Russia. We spoke exclusively to one of these manufacturers who told us how the war kick started Ukraine's national drone unit. Now I think Ukraine is a leader in this area in our wrath for it. Which drones were used last weekend is still a tight-lipped secret. But experts say his drones are identical to those seen in images of the attack, and were most likely the ones us imagines. We can produce very good drones for special mission, and yet we will protect our country from Russian aggression. He shares some extraordinary ins into how it was possible for Ukraine to target so deep into Russia, hitting an airbase 2,500 miles away. Is it possible to remote control that drone from Ukraine? While the drone was in Bologna Air Base, for example, no problem. We can coordinate our drones in Moscow. We need to link across satellite and across mobile dollars. Or maybe our pilot will say near any. And the success of the program is apparent by the damage left behind. Multiple air bases hit, some in our Far East. Ukraine claims it inflicted $7 billion worth of damage on Russian weapons, though that number has not been known. Even so, the details of this stealthy op are extraordinary drones smuggled in on wooden craw, then driven across Russia in Khan, catching locals by surprise as D flew out of trucks to launch the assaults. Russia now faces an even steeper challenge to its long-held dominance of the wing. Katie Pugliese, CNN London. All right, and joining me now is Seth Jones, national security expert and president of the Center for Strategic and International Planning. So Seth, you have just returned from reviewing Frontline Drone F. You've done that with top military leadership from Ukraine. So you've seen things that none of us have actually seen. What stands out to you from that, from what you saw, from what you heard about what happened on those air bases? Well, Aaron, what is how the Ukrainians used the Russian logistics system, including their mobile network, to smuggle drones into Russia itself, and then to use the mobile system and the satellite system from Russian territory as they conducted strikes. So, I mean, it's not just getting those platforms into Russian territory, but it's also taking advantage of what was available in Russia to strike targets. And it really shows how vulnerable countries can be if those kinds of drones are smew inside of those countries. Obviously, more than just Russia. Right? Well, and that sends a very sobering tee. you just said there. So when you're with that top military leadership, though, we have those big attacks overnight, some of the biggest since the war began in Kiev. Is that it? I mean, what do they think Putin is going to do? I mean, Trump made it very clear that Putin was going to do something, that she's fires off, and which it was never really on. But you get the point. What does Ukraine think is going to happen? Well, Aaron, I think there are a few things. One is the Ukrainian leadership played, and I talked to the head of the office of the president while he was in Washington this read. They do expect the Russians to conduct a ranged missile, ballistic missile, and drone strikes against including Kiev in large numbers. That's the way the Russians resp. I don't think they expect to see any kind of a nuclear res, although Putin routinely threatens those. But I think at the end of the day, the problem that the Russians have is they are not effectively conducting military operations. They're dying and really historic, at least since World War II. And so I think that's the Ukrainian response is, to keep fighting them on the cha. And that's where the Russians at their biggest weakness. Okay, so on that, we haven't heard that sort of in a while. In fact, what we've heard is that in a war of attrition, Russia will win because they have more men. And it's just that simple. And that it boils down to number, and the numbers are horrible, but they don't favor Ukraine. So the longer this continues, the more it favors Russia, right? That has become the narrative right out there. But you've got new reporting, and you're talking about struggles on the front line for Putin's forces to advance. You've got numbers on the equipment that they've lost a lot more than Ukraine. That the casualty numbers now approach 1 million for Russia. In fact, you gave us a chart that shows the daily average of casualties since the war began. And it all challenges the narrative that Putin can just continue and afford to go on indefinitely. When you went through and looked at all these numbers right now, which do challenge the current narrative, what surprised you the most? Or there were two things that surprised me, and one of them was one of the numbers that the president himself remarked out of our report in the Oval Office yesterday. One was just the sheer casualties that the Russians have suffered. Nearly 1 million. They'll hit the 1 million mark by June or July. And also, in a historical the Russians have lost now more than 5 times the number of soldiers than in all Russian wars combined between the end of World and the beginning of their full-scale invasion in February. 77-year period versus a 3-year period, a little over 3-year period. Still 5 times the number that they've lost over the last 3 years. It's just stunning in its significance. And also, the other thing that was interesting in what we found was how little territory and how slow the advance of has been slower than some of the most grinding and grisly offensive during World War I. Wow. And, when we hear about and just the sheer death and suffering in that war, trench warfare, where of course it's trench warfare here again,